Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm celebrating the holidays with a 3D retro oven cookie that's going to be fitted with a cookie turkey inside and a little royal icing pie on top, just in time for the holidays. This would also make a great pregnancy gift. Envision it with little buns in the oven, if you will, or even a housewarming gift. So let's get started with what you'll need for this project. It's basically a 5-cookie project, starting with an oven backdrop, a little oven front face that'll have a window cut in it. You'll also need 2 sides. I'm working with my gingerbread, but any sugar cookie recipe would work fine for this. Here's the other side, which I've since sprayed, which we'll talk about in the next step. And then a simple rectangle, which will be the top of the cookie, where the oven burners will go. To ice, we're going to be working with blue royal icing of a relatively thick flooding consistency, so it holds volume. We'll also be working with gray and black for some detail work. We'll need a little bit of PME Pearl Luster Spray for making the gingerbread look shiny and chrome-like. For the window in the oven, we'll be working with Isomalt, which is a form of sugar, which we'll be hydrating and bringing to a boil a little bit later. And then for some final finishing touches, such as trim, a little bit of gray fondant, a little bit of black fondant, and lots of pre-made dials and other accessories, which I'll also touch on in this video. So let's talk first about how to cut these more interesting shapes. So all these shapes for the oven are custom shapes. They're not standard off-the-shelf cookie cutters, but I will have all the dimensions in the video description. To cut them, I use custom templates, and I have a whole nother video about how to cut with custom templates. I tend to prefer to work with acetate templates because they're easily rinsed off and reused as opposed to cardboard, but if all you've got is cardboard, that'll work just fine as well. I'm going to start by cutting the oven face with the window in it, which involves cutting with a rectangular template and then cutting using another standard cutter actually to cut the window out and to cut the little feet in it. So you can get creative. These are so-called Franken cookies. Somebody in the cookie world coined that term, which is to mean a cookie that's morphed into other shapes, starting with a standard cutter or a template, and then either subtracting dough or adding dough to make interesting new and different shapes. And so that's what we're doing with basically all 5 of these pieces. I'm rolling about 3/16 of an inch thick, which is my typical thickness. To keep the templates from sticking, a light dusting on top is sometimes good. And here I've got my oven template. I like to roll directly on my silicone mat, these large irregular shapes. These are about 3.5 inches by 3 3/4 inches, and not move them off the mat to get them on the cookie sheet, but instead move the entire mat up onto the back of the cookie sheet. That'll prevent distortion of the actual piece that I'm cutting. So I'm going to actually leave all the extraneous pieces on there until I've cut the window. That way it's going to be less likely to misshape. And for the window, I've anchored it. I'm going to just lightly mark out where I want it before I actually cut into it. I'm going to use this rectangular Atiko cutter twice to create an oblong window, and I just am gently scoring to make sure it's centered before I plunge it in, and that looks pretty good. And it goes, then one right next to it. And then I'll take those out. Now I can remove the outer pieces because I need to gain access to the bottom to cut the foot. And all this dough can be reused. I'm going to ball it up and roll it again. And for the foot, I've used another standard Atiko cutter, for which I'll have the dimensions and sources in the video description. I'm just cutting off a little feet there. Now for the side of the oven, very similar to the oven face, we'll need 2 of these pieces. I'm taking my other template, which is a little bit shorter along one length, about 2 5/8 inches, I believe, and 3 3/4 tall, though again, I'll have the exact dimensions in the video description. I'm using one big knife to make the cuts along the edges of the template, rather than dragging a paring knife through there. I find I get the cleanest cuts that way, though you occasionally might need to clean the blade. Anything stuck on here will leave a less clean cut. Pull away the excess. Lift it off. And I'm using a smaller version of the little plaque cutter from Atiko to cut the feet in the sides. This is slightly smaller than the one used for the oven face. This comes as a graduated set of 3 cutters, I believe. And lastly, we'll move on to the most complicated of the 5 pieces, which is the back of the oven. It's actually very much like the oven face, the bottom part, but I've added a little piece on top using another cutter. So let's start by cutting the bottom piece. Again, using the oven face template for that. I try to leave myself enough at the top so I can get the other piece cut out of the top. But we can always roll more dough if we don't have enough. So no window will be cut in this time, but I do want to cut the same feet in the bottom. Back to that big fluted piece for the feet, like so. I'm looking overhead to make sure it's centered, and then just cutting it away. So now I'm going to cut the top piece for the oven back. This piece I want to generously flour because I do need to move it and bring it up so that it's lined up with the bottom part of the back. So I'm just running my ruler under it to make sure it's free moving before I do too much work on it. And then I'm going to take this plaque cutter. I'll have the source in the video description and just use that to cut the top. I can actually get 2 top pieces out of it most likely. I'm going to cut the edges straight. So I've got my piece, and I don't want the top piece extending too much larger than an inch here. So I'm going to cut it roughly in half, and that way I can get 2 oven pieces out of it. And then I just want to place it as close as possible to the other piece. You can use a little egg wash there to stick them together, but I typically don't. I'll stick that in the oven and the 2 will bake into each other and fuse together, creating a piece such as this in the end. And I'm just going to be demonstrating the icing on the sides of the cookies for the most part and the tops because all the other pieces follow the same process. We're basically going to go from a naked gingerbread cookie to one that's sprayed with a little bit of luster spray so that if any exposed edges show in the final construction, they're going to look like stainless steel or chrome, to an iced piece. Now I'm choosing to ice in panels. You could just ice it simply flat, but I thought that would give it a little more interest, and I'm going to show you how I do that. But first, let's get to tracing out some guidelines on these, and then we'll spray. This one I've already traced some guidelines for the panels. You'll see I just used a ruler, and I used an edible marker with food coloring in it. I just traced a little rectangle about 1/2 inch from the edges and also a guideline along the bottom where the feet will go. And I want to make sure the guideline matches up on all the other pieces as well along the foot area. So I draw a similar guide, for instance, on the oven here. The oven top, which is the other piece that I'm going to be really mostly demonstrating, will get sprayed, but we want to have some little holes where the burners are going to go. So I do want to trace those out, and I'm using a 7/8 inch cutter. You could rule them so they're equal distances from the edges. And I like to do this before I spray the cookies so that some of the outline is hidden in the spraying process and less noticeable. So for spraying, I use a PME Pearl luster spray. It will look silver when it goes down. Give it a good shake. And I prefer this to painting with a silver dust extended with extract because I'm covering a large swath of cookie. This will go down much more quickly and much more evenly. For the oven, I want to make sure I get the oven top. I want to make sure I get the top because we'll be seeing those exposed silver areas in the final construction. For all the other pieces, it's just necessary to get the sides. And I spray it somewhat at a distance because you don't want it really pooling up. So as I said, I'm going to be icing these in panels rather than one big flat area, though that's certainly an option too. And to ice in panels, I mean in sections. And to do that, I like to use a relatively thick royal icing. I've got about 1 to 2 teaspoons of water for every cup of my thick royal icing glue to get it to a kind of a thick flooding consistency. And I do that so it holds some shape and puffiness. And I also like to pipe non-adjacent areas so that they don't merge into each other. Stick it in the dehydrator to quick set them and then come back and fill in the other areas. So you'll see me alternating areas as I pipe this and periodically setting it in the dehydrator to dry off sections as I go. I'm going to use the same consistency icing for outlining and flooding so that hopefully that outline that I'm piping now will disappear into the flood icing and be less distinct. So I'm going to lay the outline and immediately come in and flood. I didn't trace these little diagonal lines, so I'm just going to pipe them down just straight to the corner. to mark off this section at the top. And then immediately flood so that the outline blends into the flood icing. Again, where you get into a tight corner, take your trussing needle and just make sure everything is nice and flat and pushed into the corner. Now I'd set that in the dehydrator and work on another piece while these are quick setting. So while that's happening, I'm going to start outlining and flooding the oven top so you can see how that process occurs. All the other panels of the oven, the back, the face, and the other side are basically outlined and flooded the way I'm doing the side. This one's just a little bit different because I'm going to be leaving these spaces clear of icing in the middle. In this piece, I have to work in one big unit so it looks nice and smooth. I'm not going to be doing it in sections, so in that sense, it's different as well. Circles don't have to be perfect. We're going to be putting little fondant burners around them later. And I want to immediately start flooding so that all these little lumps and things, breaks in the border, are flattened down. And we will continue in this vein until the whole cookie's done. So if you don't outline, you can always just draw very close to the edge and create a similar effect. Okay, this has been in the dehydrator for just a few minutes. It's still a little bit glossy, so I may be tempting fate and moving forward too quickly, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to choose to pipe the side area as it's got the least intersection with any other area right up there. And we'll pipe that area last. I just don't want them blending together. And then flooding. I can probably do one more section here, and then we'll get it back in the dehydrator before we do the last two. And that looks really nice. We'll go into the dehydrator and then complete the last two sections. Now, once you've completely piped the center section and the remaining side section, the completed cookie should look something like this, as should all of your other panels. Okay, I've been busy. I have since outlined, detailed, I should say, with gray and added some little gray dots to one of my side panels, also to my front oven face. Also to the back, but just at the top. I don't need to fill out the entire back because we're going to be putting the oven face will be fitting up right against here. And none of this will be seen. And I've done the same. Here's my finished oven burner top, fully flooded with a little bit of detailing, outlining, and dots around the the two sides and the front. Again, this piece will be up against the oven back and doesn't need to be detailed. So I'm just going to show you the general process that's applied to the side that I haven't done. I'm just going to accentuate basically all the distinctions between the sections by piping tiny lines. My icing is fairly thick, so I have to pipe relatively slowly so I don't create breaks in it. The consistency is fairly thick. Now you may notice I've got some dots here. Those dots were actually piped between two small lines. So I'm going to pipe another tiny little rectangle within the center rectangle within which to pipe those dots. And you'll also notice I've outlined down at the bottom here. For that, I used a thicker line. I'm just tracing along the edge of the blue icing. Okay. And wherever I've doubled up lines, I'm going to be piping dots in between them. Starting here in the corners. And that completes all my icing detailing on the sides and faces of the oven. I'm going to come back in the next step and do a little bit of fondant detailing for more dimension. So let's start first with the oven clocks. I have a whole other video on how to make two-dimensional royal transfers, which is how I piped these little discs here, so I'm not going to belabor that. I'm going to refer you over to that. I piped gray icing and then sprayed it with my pearl luster spray to create this shimmery effect. And this is where we're headed To create the clock face, that's actually a stamped fondant piece. So I'm going to show you how I made that, and I'm going to apply it. Here I'm working with white rolled fondant, just kneading it a little bit so it's nice and soft before I put it through my pasta machine. And I like to roll it really thin for applications like this, typically to the number 3 setting. I've got a nice big piece, more than I need. And my stamping process is very similar to how I stamp directly on cookies. I'd like to apply food coloring. This is nothing more than my black liquid gel food coloring directly to what was once an uninked ink pad. This one has already had some black food coloring on it. So I apply some, I blot off the excess so there's not a big pool of coloring there. So normally I would mount this on an acrylic block, but this is stamped small enough that I'm just going to lightly press it into the food coloring pad and then lightly press it here. I've got a nice imprint. And then I'm going to take the narrow end of a number 804 tip it is. It's about a ½ inch across, and just cut around it. Anything that fits around it will work. And then gently knock it out with a paintbrush. And there's the little piece that'll go on top. To apply it, I just use a touch of corn syrup, and I'll just stick it right onto the center of the transfer. This is easiest to do when the transfer is still attached to the acetate underneath it, so that it doesn't move around. And there you've got a nice little clock piece. And then simply to get the transfer off, take a sharp knife. If it doesn't pop off itself, and you've got a little clock all ready to go. I made similar forms of dials using a different stamp that may or may not fit on this piece, but I used them on some of the ovens you see up there. So it's the same exact process, using smaller transfers and a slightly different stamp. I also made some other dials where I used the transfers and simply piped a small black line across the center. So we've got different options for dials there, basically starting with the same gray royal icing transfer sprayed with pearl luster dust. So let's move on to these cute little burners. These are also a transfer of sorts, made of mostly of fondant and a little bit of royal icing for the lines that go across the top. And I do them on acetate and then lift them off a little bit later as well. But I do start with fondant for those. And I'm going to roll that to, I believe, the number 1 setting on my pasta machine, so it's relatively thick. I want it to have some relief. You could even use a rolling pin for this if you want them even thicker. So that looks good. I believe I cut this with a 7/8 inch cutter, and then the back side, the wide side of a standard pastry tip to create the ring. Drop that onto my acetate. This is an acetate lined cardboard with a little cardboard under it for structure. Center my tip on that to create a ring and press down. And then to pull out the center, you might need your trussing needle again. I want to leave that there, maybe flatten it a little bit. And then for the centerpiece of the burner, I have another little fondant piece that I'm cutting with the other end of this number 12 tip. This is maybe a 1/4 inch apart. And I'm just going to stick it right in the middle. The fondant's a little damp, so it's got a little tackiness to it, and it's kind of sticking to the acetate, which is what I want at this point. And you'd make as many as you need. We need 4 for this particular oven top. I'm just going to show you 1. And you can either do 4 lines across the burner or 8. I did 8 in this case, and I just start by just piping lines with my royal icing of outlining consistency from the center to the edge. So you can leave the burner as is with just the lines, or come back in and also pipe a little gray dot in the center, which is what I did on this particular transfer here. Now you don't want to lift this until the fondant's completely dry, or you'll misshape it and also break the icing, but once it's completely dry, these easily slide off with a paring knife, if not on their own, so that they can be placed on top of the cookie, which we'll do in the next step. Just to give you an indication of how I did these alternative dials, same black icing. While the transfers are still stuck to the acetate, I'll pipe, and it's okay to go a little bit off the transfer if it's easy for you, because that'll break off when we lift it. I'm just piping a diagonal line across them. and so on. And these have already dried, and as you'll see, there's a little tag of black icing there. When I lift it, that may or may not break. Typically it does break, and they look very nice and uniform. Now let's put these pieces on the cookies. So I've got one oven face done. This guy, the clock is a little bit bigger and the top is a little bit shorter, so I'm not going to be able to fit as much on there. I think I'm just going to fit one clock in the center and a few dials to either side, so we won't use that fancy dial in the center. So it's just really a gluing and pasting process. A little bit of thick icing glue. Make sure that clock is oriented with the number 12 up, and I'm going to center it in that area. And then I'm going to put a few dials to either side. Sometimes it's easier to pipe directly on the piece if you don't need very much. And then just drop them into the icing. I think that looks pretty darn good for the oven face. Let's move on now to the oven top. Just locate those burners. For this, I'm using a white glue or a gray glue in all these gluing operations. Here's the top piece of one already finished. That's what we're trying to replicate. I like to use a white glue against light colors because it's just easier to clean off. And I'm going to make sure I pick 4 relatively matching burners, and you can see how easy they are to move once they're completely dry. And we'll just stick a little bit of icing in the middle and set that burner on top of it. You just want to make sure that it's made contact with the icing underneath. And again, I don't necessarily line up the burners. I think if they're all kind of turned in different directions, it looks a little more natural. So that's the completed top piece. And then lastly, we want to put some handlebars on the oven piece. I like to fully decorate the oven piece before I put the window in. We're going to be putting the window in with Isomalt in the next step. Now these pieces here are just pre-dried fondant ribbons. I have a whole nother video about how to cut fondant strips and ribbons, so you can be referred to that. I'm just going to put one down with very little icing right here in the center of this oven drawer at the very bottom that I piped. And I want this handlebar at the top to be a little bit elevated. So I am going to put 2 little pieces of dried fondant down first and then rest this crossbar on it, on those. If they stick out a little bit, it's not the end of the world. You could also cut them smaller than I have here. I think that's pretty good. So this is just black dried fondant. This one has a thin bit of gray that I also piped, gray icing that I piped across it, and that looks good. Now I'd let that completely dry before we fill it with Isomalt and move on to the assembly process. So now's the time for the really fun part, which is adding the very lifelike glass, which is actually Isomalt, which is a form of sugar that's less prone to wilting and spotting. Now to prepare the Isomalt, looks something like this. It's just white little granules. And we need to hydrate it a little bit with water. So I've got a 1/2 cup of Isomalt here. I don't need very much for this one window, but you can mix up any amount you want. And I typically use 4 times as much Isomalt as I do water. I'm just trying to make a little sludge here. So I'm going to add about 1/8 of a cup of water to this to make a slurry. Then we're going to put it on the oven and bring it to 320 degrees Fahrenheit. So just adding the water here, and you don't need a lot. The less water you have in here, the less you'll have to evaporate off, and the faster it'll get to 320. So I'm going to stick that on medium-high heat and let it boil. While that's working, and that'll take a little while, the only other comment I want to make here is that I am pouring this directly onto a silicone mat because it'll be easy to detach from that. You can pour onto parchment paper, but parchment paper tends to buckle more under the heat of the sugar and it'll leave a little wave in the window, which you may or may not like. You want to make sure your mat or your parchment paper is completely clean of any debris because it'll be picked up in the sugar glass. So it has reached 320 degrees Fahrenheit, and you'll see all those little sugar granules, those white little granules are completely dissolved, which is what you want. And it's still clear. You don't want any browning to it. But I've got a lot of bubbles in it, so I am going to let it sit ever so slightly until a lot of those bubbles subside, because if I pour it immediately, I'm going to have a lot of bubbles in my window. Okay, most of the bubbles are now subsided. There's still some in there. But I'm going to go ahead and pour it because if you wait too long, it can thicken and you'll get ridges in your sugar syrup. So let me make sure it's centered over the cookie, as close to it as I can get. And we want to fill the entire area. I've got a lot of bubbles in there, so we are going to do some popping. If they don't pop on their own. Now we're going to let that completely set. It could be a minute or less, and then we should be able to pull it off the silicone quite easily, and you'll see how beautifully shiny it is. So it's literally been just a few minutes. You can see how easily it just lifts right off the silicone mat, and I've got this gorgeously clear window. There are, I don't know if the camera's picking up, there are a little bit of crosshair marks on this. That's because there's some texture to my mat. If you don't like that, then work on parchment, but you might pick up a ripple or find a silicone mat that doesn't have quite as much texture as mine. But I think it looks okay, and I think it looks a little more vintage that way. Okay, we're on to the finishing details and final assembly. As you'll notice on my side panels and my oven tops and all pieces but my oven face, the little dot work that I piped earlier has a slight sheen to it, and that was done by painting on with edible luster spray. In this case, I sprayed a little bit of the spray into my paint palette, and I am just going to paint with it while it's still liquid. It will quickly evaporate because it's primarily alcohol based, but you can paint with it as well. I just wanted to show you that. So I'm going to finish off these little dots here with a little bit of sheen on the oven face. And as you run out of spray or it dehydrates, just spray more fresh stuff into your palette and you can continue. You might want to go over it twice so it's super shiny. But I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and start putting this together. So I'm going to start by just putting a little bit of glue here to accept the first side. And again, we filed these sides all in advance, so hopefully they'll fit really nicely. I'm going to do the same thing up the other side. So again, thick royal icing glue. The thicker it is, the faster this will dry and the more quickly we'll be able to move it around. Though I would typically give it, after gluing it together like this, at least an hour of drying time. And once you've got it into a position you like, then get all those blocks in place and do let it dry. Before I put this all together, I'm also going to reinforce the seam with a little more icing from the outside, just to make sure it's completely engaged. And filling the seam, you want to wipe it flat so that the fondant we put on it later will lay flat. So that's sort of what I'm looking for in terms of filling the seams, and you want to do that to both sides. Before you put the top on, it's also a good idea to reinforce from the top with a little icing on the inside. Okay, I'm ready now with some drying time to put this together. Ideally, I would have given it a little bit more. And one thing you'll notice, I didn't ice all the way down to this level on the back, which I probably should have, because if I had, my top would have fit nicely like that all the way to the front face of the oven. But it's got a little gap there, but as I say in cookie decorating, it's often the art of masking errors. So what I'm going to do is just put a little fondant stopper here. A little thick strip of fondant, if you will. I would just to fill that gap. And then that's going to match the trim that I'm putting elsewhere on this. So it's not going to be the end of the world. It's actually what I did on those ovens up there as well, and you can hardly tell. So I'm sticking that down with a little bit of corn syrup. And so just tuck in that fondant in there with a little bit of corn syrup, and that'll fill that gap nicely. It'll look like a lot like the trim I'm going to be putting along the side seams. And as you see, it fits nicely much more to the front of the oven. We'll also be trimming out the front of the oven too. You'll see that this piece curved a little bit, so there's a little bit of gap there, and that's the reason I like to trim out the front of the oven a bit. But let's just glue that in place. Again, a little bit of icing, gray icing glue is really all that's needed. For this piece, I tend to use as little as possible so it doesn't poke out. It's really the under support that needs to be really structurally sound. And get that nice and squared up. So for trimming these out, again, I'm using fondant strips that I cut to the number 2 setting on my pasta machine. Roll them out, and I have a whole nother video about about cutting ribbons, and that's all that is. And I'm just going to trim out the side seams like so, and it'll look a little bit neater. And to stick them down, a little bit of corn syrup. You can either put it on the back of the ribbon or along the seam itself. I'm going to try it along the seam itself. Just trying to cover that icing blob there. I put the side seams down first, and then I'll come back in and put some seams, a seam along the top edge. Take my knife to cut away any extra at the top and the bottom, and also to straighten it out at this stage if you need to. So I would trim this out as well and then start on the top seams. And on the top seam, I like to do the front face first, so I've got enough depth. And I think I needed a little bit longer here, a little bit wider ribbon than I used on the sides to cover that gap. So I've got a slightly wider piece here. This is what I used on the side seam. And I'm just going to attach that the same way. Trying to keep the corn syrup off the iced parts of the cookie. And I do this in 3 sections, so I'll just take it across the front face. It's too hard to trim it out in pieces that are much longer than this because it starts to stretch. So gently press it into place and straighten it with your paring knife before the corn syrup dries. And then continue in that vein until it's all trimmed out. Once it's dried up, we'll be ready to deck it out with the pie and turkey I talked of and make it ready for Thanksgiving. And there she is, my vintage oven. We've got another lovely up here, all waiting to be decorated for Thanksgiving or the Christmas holiday season. I've got lots of little accessories to do that. I'm going to be talking about each of them in great detail in my accessories video that's upcoming in a couple of weeks. For now, I'm just going to show you how to rig things in place. As I said, once this is dry, it's something you can completely lift up. I've got an airbrushed rug. I've got a little bit of icing on here because I had been playing with it before, but this is airbrushed. If you have questions about airbrushing, do email me because I'm not covering that in the next video. I'm going to place my little cookie turkey inside. You could stack this up on actual cookies. I'm just using a cookie cutter so that it adheres through the window in the right spot. And I will be talking about how to make the turkey in the next video. Of course, you're going to want some light on that turkey, so I've got a fun little LED. These last about 8 hours. They're pretty bright. But I know from previously rigging these that I do need to stick it in something so it stands upright and you can really see it and it doesn't fall over in the oven. So I've stuck it in a little bit of fondant there. I'm going to just put this over the top so you can see your turkey barely through there. If my window were a little clearer, you could really see it, and you can certainly see the oven light. And now we want to decorate both the floor and the top of the oven. I've got braided rugs, which is nothing but a piece of fondant piped with royal icing. I've got little oven mitts. And we're going to act like this one's fallen on the floor. I've got a full-blown turkey, which we could set on the top like so, cooling out of the oven, ready to be eaten. But I think what I prefer to do is put my pumpkin pie on one of the burners with a little spatula. We'll be talking about how to make the turkey, the pumpkin pie, and this little plate of cookies in my accessories video. And so there she is, perfectly outfitted for the holidays, beautiful centerpiece, even a housewarming gift. And again, I'll touch on all the edible accessories, namely the pie, the cookies, and the turkeys in my upcoming video. Till then, live sweetly.